Good morning, and can I welcome everyone to the 29th meeting of the Economy and Fair Work Committee in 2025. Today we will be hearing from Consumer Scotland, but before we do, I'll move to agenda item number 1, in which I will invite Sarah Boyack, who's joining the committee, to make a declaration of interest, should she wish to. Sarah.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm going to declare a declaration of interest in my former employment at the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. It's not directly relevant to most of our work, but it will occasionally crop up, so I wanted to put that on the record. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Can I also note that we've got apologies this morning from Lorna Slater, who's unable to be with us. Agenda item number 2, can I have members' agreements take agenda items 4 and 5 in private? Great. So we now come to agenda item 3. And as I said, we have Consumer Scotland with us this morning as part of our pre-budget scrutiny. And I believe that they would like to make a brief introductory statement. Mr. Wilson.
Yep, thank you. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you this morning. So by way of introduction, I'm David Wilson. I'm Chair of the Board of Consumer Scotland, and with me this morning, Sam Gabaldon, who's Chief Executive, and Sue Bomfrey, who's our Director of Operations and Partnerships. In terms of an opening statement, when we met last year, around this time last year, consumers were facing very significant challenges from the cost of living crisis. Those challenges haven't gone away, and our focus on designing and advocating measures to help address debt and hardship, remains at the top of our priority list. But all of our work is aimed at enhancing outcomes for consumers to deliver tangible benefits for the people of Scotland. Our advocacy is based on hard evidence and shaped by our consumer principles. And our work also has a wider benefit of promoting and improving consumer confidence overall, which in turn contributes to economic growth and prosperity. Over the last year, we've continued to build on our core activities funded by consumer levies on energy, post and water. And we've broadened that out into a wider range of consumer markets. We've undertaken research and made representations to government on a wide range of issues, including reform of the electricity market, the switch off of radio teleswitch meters, the continuing affordability challenges facing consumers, and revisions to the regulatory and pricing controls of Royal Mail and Scottish Water. Just briefly, I wanted to touch on a couple of examples of our specific pieces of work centred around what are our statutory duties as set out in our founding legislation. The first of those was we've sought to raise the profile of the government's consumer duty, which places a duty on public bodies to take into account the interests of consumers in their strategic decision making. And we've been very active working with a range of public bodies to try and promote its implementation. Secondly, continuing a theme which I know we've touched on in previous discussions, where we continue to work with the Office of Public Safety and Standards on the recall of goods, and I'm happy to give you an update on that. And over the last year, we're taking on a new role as the statutory advocate for heat network consumers, and we've built up our capability in that and established an advisory function working in partnership with Citizens Advice Scotland and Advice Direct Scotland. And in perhaps one of the key initiatives that we've made over the last year is that we have undertaken and published our first statutory investigation into the conversion of home heating and the market for energy efficiency products in domestic properties. The full report of that was published in July, and we're happy to give you further information on that if you wish. And finally, we've worked closely with other public sector partners on the new climate change framework for policymakers. Finally, just to record, we will publish the full details of our activities in our annual report and accounts. They'll be published next month. That provides a comprehensive overview of our recent work. It includes an update on our overall financial information and also our assessment of our performance. And we're particularly pleased this year, for the third year running, we've had a clean bill of health from our external auditors. So on that basis, thank you again for the invitation, and we're delighted to take questions.
Thank you very much. I'll start the opening question before I bring in members, but you touched there on your annual report, which isn't yet published. Can I ask why? Because obviously it's very difficult for us to do pre-budget scrutiny if we don't actually have an annual report in front of us.
If I may, I'll make a brief comment and then I'll pass to Sue to give you further details. I think the important point is the substantial amount of work that needs to go into the annual report. Our formal deadline is the end of the year. We worked very actively to try and complete that work as soon as possible, but we certainly completely understand the point, and we'd like to have had that report published before now. But as, the work is complete, and we're happy to share any information that's in the report. But I understand the concern that you've raised.
But before you do, I mean, just on that point, so you state in your last year's annual report that one of your primary risks is stability of funding from the Scottish Government. So given that you're going to produce your annual report really a matter of weeks before the Scottish Government will introduce its budget, how is the Scottish Government supposed to set its budget and do so confidently if it doesn't know how you essentially estimate your performance in the previous financial year?
Certainly the Scottish Government have been we've been actively engaged with the Scottish Government on the development of on the annual report. They've seen all the content of it, and they've certainly seen the details of our performance assessment. We're actively engaged with them, so they are seeing all of that information. But the final document that has been through the process of external audit and been approved through the Audit Scotland processes, that's not finalised for publication yet, but we've certainly been very active with the Scottish Government.
But you understand the point, in terms of our scrutiny, it makes it very difficult.
I do.
It has been a frustrating process for us this year because all the work was completed for our Audit and Risk Committee, which was the 23rd of September. Unfortunately, there were some unforeseen delays at Deloitte's side, who are our external auditors, which has led to a sort of 4-week delay in publishing. The accounts were now signed last week and have been sent to Audit Scotland. Current turnaround time, we're being advised from Audit Scotland, is 2 weeks. Once we get that approval from Audit Scotland, we will then publish the accounts.
Okay. So again, Mr Wilson, in your opening statement, you stated that your key focus on outcomes for consumers in Scotland. Indeed, the statutory aims are about reducing harm to consumers, increasing consumer confidence, increasing the extent to which consumers' matters are taken into account by public bodies, promoting sustainable practices and the use of goods by consumers, and otherwise advancing well-being. So there's a heavy emphasis on consumers. How do you measure those outcomes? Because, again, looking at last year's annual report, so an awful lot of articulation of outputs, but not necessarily any measure of outcomes for consumers.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to give you some further details. And I'd say that there's a substantial report of this covered in the annual report. I mean, the main thing is we published a performance framework, as we called it, in December 2023, which sets out a number of ways that we measure our impact and performance. So that the past year was the first full year of operation of that performance framework, and that's what's reported in the annual report. It covers 4 broad areas. The first is our role is we're an advocacy organisation, so our role is to influence and seek to make a difference for consumers by advocating on behalf of consumers. And over the last year, we've made around 200 recommendations to public bodies, to the Scottish Government, to the UK Government, to utility regulators and to business and industry in themselves. And the first part of the 4-point performance framework monitors those recommendations and what happens to each of those recommendations. And just by way of example, there's a number of areas that they cover. I mean, we've made recommendations around where we've got a particular expertise in terms of modelling or economic analysis, and that we've made recommendations. There's other ones which seek to provide recommendations and acting as a voice for consumers, where perhaps those consumers don't have a voice otherwise. We've also have a number of recommendations around advice and information. And finally, we have a particular role about fairness and recommendations in support of particular needs of particular groups of consumers is a key part of our activity. So monitoring the recommendations we make and assessing what impact that has with other organisations is the first part of our performance assessment. The second is what we call impact assessment reviews, which, for those who are aware of it, in the academic world, in universities, they have a particular theme around doing impact case studies, where they'll take a piece of research and chart through what, how that research was done and what impact it has had on public policy or in terms of feeding into other work. And what we've tried to do is do something similar with a group of our own recommendations. And this year we assessed what we've done around climate change, and particularly what we've done around the transition from traditional landlines to using internet and broadband-based landlines or lines. And that work, that we've already published the detail of those assessment reviews. Thirdly, we monitor the various different work streams that we publish. We publish an annual work plan on an annual basis, and we obviously monitor those individual work streams, and we published a work plan on an annual basis, and in the annual report we assess how we've done on each of those. And finally, where you touched on the point about output measures, we fully recognise the need to have a balance of both outcomes and output measures, but we have a set of organisational activity measures on such things as number of news releases, number of published reports, our engagement events, social media impact and the like, as you would expect us to have, and we report on that as well. So a combination of those outcomes, that impact assessment and the activity indicators give us a picture of how we're doing as an organisation.
I'm going to come to those points about engagement, but coming back to the original question, listening to what you said there, it sounds like you're measuring outcomes as being influencing other parts of the public sector, not actually about consumer benefit. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, most people would describe that as outcomes. I think they would describe that as output. Okay. And you actually ultimately in your opening statement you described your objective as being actually creating benefit to consumers in Scotland, but nothing in what you just provided in that answer really described benefits to consumers in Scotland, unless I'm missing something.
I think I certainly do think that we have an impact and we lead to benefit to consumers. But principally, given the nature of what we do, we are an advocacy organisation. Our legal, our statutory basis is to provide, statutory advice to UK Scottish Government. We have a role with regard to providing information and research and analysis. We don't have enforcement powers, or we're not a regulatory body in the sense that an Ofgem or an Ofcom or trading standards would be. So what we see as our role is seeking to influence how other organisations perform their duties, and to be an advocate and a voice for consumers that can link together the different needs of consumers, whether on whether it's an energy matter, a water matter, post or other consumer markets, and try and draw comparisons and linkages across the two. So we achieve benefits for consumers via influencing others. That's how we were set up. That's what we do.
You assess your output. Again, and I have to go off your last year's annual report rather than this one. If I look at page 15 of your previous year's annual report, okay, you outline some of your publications and outputs. And it states there that in the previous year you produced just 34 publications. That's just more than one publication per employee in your organisation. That includes, of that 34, 9 of those publications were press releases and 2 blog posts. If I then look at the figures for your website interactions, just under 19,000 total views, but in terms of unique users, between 3,000 and 4,000, with an average engagement time of 2 minutes. Now, if you're essentially judging yourself in terms of your influence on others, even if it is other organisation, for only barely not even 4,000 people in Scotland to be using your information, is that a sign of success? And will this year's annual report does it substantially improve on those figures?
Yes, it does do. I think it's both an improvement, but it's also an indication of our evolution and growth as an organisation. I mean, obviously that's 3 years in full, so we're growing and developing. But just by way of comparison, and I recognise again that in an ideal world you would have had our updated numbers. Over the last year, it's 91 published reports, 23 news releases, 70,000 views on our website, and we've also had a number of engagement events with consumers. We've had 15 engagement events. And 2 other things that are perhaps particularly important. We've, as part of the monitoring that I set out earlier, we seek to monitor the number of times that we are I suppose in university speak, cited, but mentioned in parliamentary and government documents. In other words, where a government or a regulator has said that they have been particularly influenced, or that they've recognised the contribution that we've made, and there's 40 of those. But the single biggest impact in terms of our activities, I think, over the last year was around our investigation, where the announcement of our recommendations on the Converting Home Heating report, that had very substantial both broadcast and newspaper coverage. We estimate there was over 7 million opportunities for people to view us in the wider media. And I think that was an example, now that we're fully up and running as an organisation, where we can make a substantial impact, which is widely recognised and acknowledged and heard, both by consumers and by stakeholders and decision makers, not just in Scotland, but across the UK.
So, just in terms of those numbers, I mean, how many unique visitors to your website does that equate to?
70,000.
70,000. No, that sounds like views. Doesn't matter.
Sorry, come back on one individual.
I mean, given that in the previous year's annual report,
sure
18,767 views translated to 3,786 unique users, which are, if you could maybe come back to us with that, it's not important.
We're just checking the numbers.
At this point, I'll hand over to Gordon MacDonald. Gordon.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, panel. I've got a couple of questions to ask, but before I go on to them, I want to ask about the annual report again. So just so I've got it clear in my mind, last year's annual report was published on the 17th of October. You're 4 weeks later. Is that because of an internal pressure within Deloitte's, or is it a problem with your own audit? What's the reason for the delay? Because, you know, as the convener's already indicated, it makes our role very difficult when we don't see the annual report and we're relying on something that's completely out of date.
I completely understand that. The delay has been on Deloitte's side. So all of our fieldwork was completed in August. We had our draft ISA 260 audit report from Deloitte at the beginning of September, and we were all ready to present to the ARC and the board on the 23rd of September to recommend for signing. But Deloitte then had some internal pressures, so the final reviews that they do were unable to be completed in time for that board meeting. So we received the final version week before last, and the report was signed last Wednesday.
Okay. So on the basis of the 23-24 Deloitte report, it highlighted that Consumer Scotland had not developed a long-term plan covering the period 5 to 10 years, and you were to have that ready by Q4 24-25. Can you give us an update on where you are on that? Yes,
so we have a 10-year plan now, which has been seen by the auditors and reviewed as part of the evidence for the annual report and accounts. So we haven't published that, but we do have a 10-year plan, which we're using to factor into the discussions we're having with the Scottish Government about next year's budget. And also we are having a regular challenge on that with both the Audit and Risk Committee on the board, and certainly around scenario planning and understanding what we would do in the event of any funding challenges further than we have already.
Okay. So moving on to my two subjects that I've raised questions with you in the past. One is about product recall. You said you had an update to give us. I'm keen to understand previous discussions we've had about this. You've said you didn't want to duplicate the Office, I'm trying to remember the name of it now, the Office for Product Safety and Standards database, and I accept that, right? Because I had a look at that database this morning. It's got nearly 3,000 items on it, of which 360 are serious items of harm to consumers that have been announced in 2025. Now, I know you've got a link to your website, and you've got a Twitter account. The Twitter account in the latest danger of electrification for a vacuum cleaner had 103 hits. Are you doing enough to publicise to the people of Scotland that there are serious harm out there with some consumer products when you're getting 103 hits?
So we have, notwithstanding last year's conversation, we've gone away and done a lot more work, and we continue to work with OPSS. And there are probably a couple of key points to draw out from that. So one is we're working with them on the functionality of the website, because I think, it's not very easy to navigate, it's not very consumer friendly. Their main mechanism for promulgating information has been through other bodies, so ROSPA or specific organisations that promulgate information to interested parties. But we have been doing some workshops with them, so they are redeveloping the database, and we're expecting to get a more user-friendly one summer next year. In addition, we are also going to be, and sorry, I should have added, they'll be carrying out interviews with various stakeholders around the design of that database so that it takes those into account. We are also going to be running a bespoke public information campaign on local radio and social media to run over the Black Friday Christmas period this year, and that's just about to launch. We hope that that will encourage consumers to register electrical goods. We know that a lot of consumers don't register goods when they get them, even though the documentation, because quite often it involves scanning a QR code, which not everyone's familiar with, particularly vulnerable consumers. So we are going to be launching that campaign. In addition, as you've mentioned, we have done targeted social media posts and posts on our website about specific products. So the ones noted were LED glow sticks, travel adapters and hair straighteners, and some of those have had up to sort of 1,300 views.
Months, because I've just wandered through your Twitter account. You've been lucky if you hit 600.
Yeah, I think we are mainly now, Sam's going to correct me, we're not so much using Twitter and using Blue Sky.
Blue Sky on Twitter, but I think there's been a significant downfall in Twitter activity, not just on our side.
There has been, but you've got no presence on Blue Sky.
We are on Blue Sky.
You have got an account, but it doesn't have product recalls on it, right. And you've got no Facebook page, and do you put out press releases about I know you can't put it out against every product recall, but there's 361 product recalls of a serious nature in 2025, roughly one per day. You know, it's no beyond the wit of man to put a tweet in about every single one, or a Facebook post, or a Blue Sky post, or a press release, one per day. It's not exactly onerous, I wouldn't have thought. So, I mean, what are you doing to highlight to the public that there are serious problems with some products out there?
I think the campaign will highlight the database and also where to go and find information. And we want to then build on that, as you say. I think it's reasonable to expect that we are promulgating more, but also making sure that we've got the people attached to those channels to see those updates, and also continuing to use the third sector organisations to also promulgate those messages.
Okay, the other issue I've got, and then I'll pass back to the convener, is about investigations. Now, you were hoping in previous conversations, now I know the organisation only became operational in 2022, and you highlighted in previous discussions that you wanted to have 1 or 2 investigations per year. You've only produced one, and you've announced a second one. So where are we with that, and how are you going to ratchet that up?
So we obviously we spent a period of time getting our investigation functions thinking through how it operates, how it's developed, and we had that set up. So the first investigation was launched last year. We published the results of that in June, and we've it's a thorough process, so it takes time. And we only have 2 people in our investigations team. Obviously, there are sort of resource capacity limits. And we were pleased to announce the second one yesterday. Both the subjects on used cars, I should say. Both the subjects we have picked so far are big subjects. They take time. We have to go through a lot of evidence. We go through a lot of stakeholder engagement. There's we're very, in fact, our legislation requires us to be very collaborative in the way we conduct them and working with stakeholders. So we hope that our plan, or our hope is the second investigation will be complete by sort of spring next year. And we will publish, obviously we'll have to take into account election timings, but we will publish that probably shortly after the election next year.
Okay. How do you decide which subjects to look at?
So we have a fairly rigorous prioritisation process, which looks at issues relating to things like, is there a high level of harm for consumers, or is it perhaps a lower level of harm but affecting many more consumers? It looks at whether there are opportunities for us to influence on the back of an investigation. It looks at whether other people are active in that area and whether they're doing things. So there are a number of criteria that we use. And in essence, we also feed off both our own evidence research about the impact of consumer detriment, for example. You'll be aware of the consumer detriment survey that was run by the CMA earlier this year. We actually funded a Scottish boost for that to get more additional data for the consumer impact in Scotland, and that's the type of evidence that we use when we arrive at that. And for example, the investigation we announced yesterday on used cars was the second highest area of consumer detriment in that survey.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Before I bring in the Deputy Convener, I believe Murdo Fraser has a supplementary question.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. I just want to follow up on the lines of questioning from my colleague Gordon MacDonald about public reach, because I think my colleague, where he was getting to was his concern that I think many of us would share, that the profile of Consumer Scotland with the wider public is not great. And I was just looking at numbers on social media reach. So on X, you are followed by 408 people. Yeah. So your post yesterday on consumer protections in the used car market has had 43 views since it went up. Now, to put that into context, another consumer organisation people might be familiar with is Which UK. Which UK have 123,600 followers on X. Now, I know X is not the beginning and end of the world, but it does suggest that you're not really reaching people in the way that other consumer organisations are able to do.
If I may come in first, and then Sam might follow up further, but I think the first point is we seek to complement what those other organisations are doing and work in partnership with them, rather than seeking to establish ourselves as another well, another Which or another Citizens Advice Scotland. We want to work in partnership with other consumer advocacy organisations, and in a sense, much of our work seeks to, as I say, complement, perhaps elevate, enhance, provide research analysis to enable other organisations to advocate alongside us. So I think that perhaps the important point is we're not trying to replicate them, we want to work with them. And particularly with regard to both product recall, but certainly on a range of other issues in terms of our advocacy around debt, around financial hardship. We're very much working in partnership with organisations, particularly Citizens Advice Scotland and Advice Direct Scotland, who do have very well-established public presence, brand awareness, and that direct impact. So we're working in partnership with them, not trying to replace them. And a particular aspect of what we've done over the last year is the Scottish Government now looks to us to fund both Citizens Advice Scotland and Advice Direct Scotland, and provides funding to us that we work with partner bodies to boost their advocacy. And I think through that joint working, that's another mechanism to boost our wider impact. So we're not expecting our Twitter account to be, or X account to be the route or the main mechanism for advocacy. It's as much a sort of reporting on what we're doing rather than necessarily a piece of our advocacy. But we're certainly working alongside others. And just the final point, particularly on the announcement we made yesterday. I mean, our communications team, I think, have been working really hard to build up the stakeholder list. You might have seen both the coverage we got in both broadsheet, tabloid and broadcast media around the announcement, and I think making a joint announcement with endorsements from Advice Direct Scotland and from the Scottish Motor Trade Association, that's really impactful. As I say, working in partnership and looking to them to communicate what we're doing as well as us doing it directly. Sam, you want to add?
I think that our work, I suppose, is, as David said, it's about influencing. So it's really important to us that we are measured and balanced in the way we present ourselves in public, in media, in public forums. And we use evidence as the basis for what we say. That helps us to be influential with regulators, with governments, with other organisations, with businesses. So we're not a campaigning organisation in that sense. But I do think, we have achieved significant media coverage for a number of issues that we've highlighted. For example, our first investigation on the RTS switch-off, we managed significant coverage on that, on the digital switchover, from our reporting on consumer attitudes on net zero. So I think we have made an impact. I think there's in media terms, obviously we can always build on that and do more. I'm keen to do so. So the more we can promote those issues, the better. The kind of another key aspect to that, I suppose, is consumer information campaigns, and that, as you know, is part of our function. Obviously, there were issues last year in terms of budget restrictions on marketing and things like that around sort of public funding, which obviously we were aligned to. But we have, for example, funded Trading Standards Scotland Shut Out Scammers TV campaign. That reached over 2 million consumers. We fund every year the Big Energy Savings activity that's run by Citizens Advice Scotland, and that reaches many consumers as well. As Sue mentioned earlier on, we're about to launch our first of our own consumer information campaigns, working with OPSS around recall of goods and encouraging people to register products. So we want to do more of that activity. Obviously, we're constrained by resource, but we want to do more. But I suppose we're developing a track record for that. We're learning about how we do that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Now hand over to Michelle Thompson, the Deputy Convener.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Just picking up on the thread that's been set by my colleagues Gordon MacDonald and Murdo Fraser, I also looked up your footprint on LinkedIn. And I looked it up on LinkedIn because LinkedIn is still, although it's changing, but it's largely considered to be a place for people in small business and large businesses. I was very surprised that I only had one connection with Consumer Scotland. I mean, I've got thousands of connections on LinkedIn, and I would have, I suppose, expected connections to be reached out from Consumer Scotland to people involved in business. So I'm surprised that there's only one connection. I did see that there's only 839 followers on LinkedIn as well. So it makes me wonder, how on earth are you going to get to the sort of reach you need to support small businesses, which is one of the focuses going ahead this year? LinkedIn is an extremely powerful tool, not just in making connections and targeting people. It's had increasing functionality over recent years. So again, it's a similar kind of comment, but in the light of your work so far, and this year rather. So do you have further plans to increase your presence in LinkedIn and utilise it effectively to get to small businesses for the work you have planned?
So yes, I mean, we do have a significant presence on LinkedIn. I sort of note what you say, and I'm a reasonable comment, and we are consistently promoting our activities in that forum. I'm slightly surprised there was only one connection to us, but I can't really get into that without knowing what that is. But I suppose in terms of the kind of key people we are seeking to influence and regularly engage with, we connect to them on LinkedIn, we connect them in other forums, we connect to them in meetings and engagement. So we regularly meet most of our stakeholders.
But, for example, Citizens Advice Scotland, which you've referenced earlier, they have 9,000 followers, just Citizens Advice Scotland on LinkedIn, whereas you have 839. And it does kind of beg the question, which is a thread that other people in the committee have been asking about, the role of kind of influencing through others. And I suppose my honest question is that if Consumer Scotland were to disappear tomorrow, who would notice and who would care? And I don't say that to be rude,
Sure.
but I'm genuinely just asking who would notice and who would care and how would you know?
Okay, I recognise that as a challenge. I think the important points that we draw attention to, I think, is the areas where we have established, I think, a set of both expertise and influence and impact are some of the key areas that are relevant to consumer harm, consumer detriment. We touched on both the used cars investigation and on the home heating investigation. They both have the potential to be very significantly influencing both the wider regulations and how government takes forward those particular areas. I mean, the home heating area in particular, I would hope our influence and what would be noticed if we weren't there was that one of the most substantial components of the transition to net zero is the way that we're transforming domestic buildings. And I think we've established a particular set of expertise and impact and influence in that area that I think would be missed. I think that's wider across the other areas. Our work with regards to working alongside the Water Industry Commission and Scottish Water in terms of championing the interests of water consumers who are increasingly facing challenges of water poverty. I think we're making an impact in that area. The areas that we've already touched on the energy areas around the switch off of RTS meters. We've made an impact in a number of these areas which wouldn't have happened in our absence. And in that sense, we've been noticed. And I think that's becoming increasingly established. Now, just
interrupt for a minute. I mean, I think it was Sam mentioned the RTS switch off earlier. I mean, that was something that vexed my office a great deal because we have what's called the Braes in Falkirk East, and there was a great many of people that were concerned they were going to be affected that. But I went back through, and I mean, I had extensive engagement with suppliers to make sure things were going to happen seamlessly, and our office, my office did. But I went through and checked my emails, and unless I'm wrong, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I didn't get any emails from Consumer Scotland as somebody who, I mean, I saw Stephen Kerr nodding there. I'm guessing that as a list MSP for that area, you also had a lot of contact, but I didn't get any kind of emails from yourselves outlining the work you were doing, but I definitely know my office was doing a great deal of work because it was a big concern for the Braes. So you've specifically referenced that, but I wasn't, as a constituency MSP, able to determine any kind of influence and impact from yourselves for this.
So maybe coming on that. So we have been very active in the RTS area. I think it was last year, might have been end of the year before, we organised a round table where we had suppliers, a lot of the energy consumer groups like ADS, Advice Direct Scotland, and Ofgem, where we highlighted our concerns there. That was about 18 months before the switch off, that sufficient progress wasn't being made. We have engaged regularly with Ofgem and suppliers on this. I will have to double check this. I'm pretty sure we have featured RTS in at least one, maybe two of the newsletters we send around MSPs and MPs. I'll double check that and get back to you. But you know, when it became apparent in June earlier this year that the switch off date was running into trouble, I wrote to Chief Executive of Ofgem looking for a number of different reassurances. One of those was that areas with the most RTS meters, for example, the north of Scotland, would not be switched off first, so that lessons could be learned in the process. And I was pleased that that approach has now been taken. Raised concerns about consumers getting meter appointments, concerns about suppliers having robust plans in place to mitigate any loss of heat or hot water. And also in particular, that consumers don't need to pay for remedial costs for rewiring or replacing cabinets or whatever it may be. Historically, those are behind the meter costs and suppliers aren't responsible. But we've been pressing Ofgem on this, and they are now working with the Energy Savings Trust on using the kind of remedial energy funds to try and support consumers in that space. But I think that we have made an impact in making sure that, given effectively what was a supplier failure in not reaching the RTS switch-off date, that, and then I suppose by UKG and Ofgem in not recognising early enough there was a looming problem, that we have ensured that our work has been to ensure that consumers were protected in the event of that.
That example you give about holding round tables about 18 months ago, I mean, you're right, it was clearly a burgeoning issue as long ago as that, and that was something I picked up on. And again, I'm sort of surprised that if you had these, I had no awareness of that, yet I had already determined at that point that it was a potentially significant enough issue for my constituency. So I suppose the point I'm making, what you're describing there, you were clearly doing a great amount of work and seeking to make a difference, but I didn't know about that, and you would have expected that the members of this committee, in particular with our alignment and my constituency interest, I would have known about it. So I think it plays to the comment we're making about not just a general lack of awareness about what it is you're doing and your footprint.
So very much welcome this discussion, because I think actually the RTS is a good example. I think we have a very, there's a strong link between what we've been trying to achieve, clearly alongside others. We're not in any sense trying to take sole credit for anything in this area, but we feel we've made a substantial difference in that area. Hearing from you that we we should have done more to be communicating what we are doing, not so much after the event, but in real time. I think that's a good and welcome challenge from you. I mean, just because Sam's mentioned it, I mean, the letter that Sam sent at the end of May, setting out, I think at that time, and to credit of a number of organisations, what was seen to be a looming crisis back in May and June. You know, we all were concerned that people would be switched off, and you know, and there would be you know, serious consequences at the end of June. That was solved, and to credit of everyone that was involved in that. But for example, that letter was a comprehensive assessment of what the regulator, you know, should be doing and taking forward. I think we published that letter at the time. But on reflection, perhaps we could have done more to be circulating that, both among MSPs, more broadly, because it's an indicator of our advocacy, as I put it, in real time, as opposed to after the event. But there is no doubt in my mind that we were making a substantial difference in that area and in many others.
And I will be aware of time for the convener. I wanted to just ask about your plans for this year, where you outlined that you're going to look at markets that deliver for small businesses. And I wanted to understand within that what you thought your primary focus might be specifically rather than generally, because the market for small businesses, where small businesses have fewer protections and rights. One particular example is around banking and commercial contracts, where small businesses, it's classified as a contract of equals if they have a commercial loan. So, and obviously that goes through the FECA, so you're not going to be able to do all that much about that. And then utilities is another area where there's already some provision in place. So it just wasn't actually clear what you thought you would be able to do for small businesses, so it'd be useful to understand more about your plans.
Well, just to add to that picture that I think you've already very clearly presented. I mean, we did some focused research with small businesses over the last year, and I think both identified and documented that insight, which is small businesses are consumers in their own right. They face many, if not all, of the same challenges that both individual consumers face, and some of the challenges of like size, lack of bargaining power in markets, the lack of a unified voice for small businesses as consumers. They face the same challenges, but in many ways they have significantly less protections than consumers have. And I think the report and the work that we've done in that area has drawn out and built on that insight. And I think identified, perhaps initially, areas where we've been advocating to the utility regulators in particular around water consumers, small water consumers, that's small businesses that use water, all of them, and energy consumers, just to have better understanding of a better awareness on the part of the utilities and the regulators on the challenges facing small businesses, better codes of conduct, better or development of the standards of service to small businesses. And the more that we look into it, I think the more we recognise the significant mileage that there is in developing that regulation of utility sectors with an eye to small businesses, which has perhaps not been given the attention sufficiently in the past. So in terms of, I think your question, we're absolutely on side with that insight and with what you're getting at, and we think we can take that forward generally with regard to small businesses. I think, and just making a link with perhaps some of our specifics, we've done substantial work on parcels, obviously delivery of parcels on behalf of small businesses by parcel companies. It's an area that it's as much a business issue as it is a final user issue. I think the used car investigation will draw out some of the challenges facing smaller operators of car dealerships and others. So weaved through all of our work, I think we want to make sure that the small business angle is as important as the final consumer angle in all we do.
My last question then is, from an efficiency and effectiveness perspective, would it not just be more efficient you know, you've got this tie-up with the Citizens Advice Scotland and so on, to give the money to the FSB or the IOD or one of the representative businesses who already, I know, will look at these areas in a much wider remit.
I think at a more general level, we're really keen to build up the links with the FSB. We've had good links with them. They've represented on our consumer network that we have with stakeholders and organisations involved in consumer advocacy. So very much we're keen to work with them. If there's more that we can do in terms of partnership working with the business business representative organisations to communicate and work with small businesses, we're very much keen to do that.
Okay.
If Sam wants to add
I can
to
just
that.
add, so our research on small businesses is going to be published in the next couple of weeks. We have actually worked very closely with the FSB on it. They've been involved in helping us sort of identify some of the areas and the topics we need to look at, and it's actually a really helpful partnership we have with them. So yeah, I think that what that report showed as well in terms of the work we're doing. So the two biggest areas that small businesses had issues with as consumers were energy sector and water sector, and we have worked with, we've made recommendations in both of those which have been successful and had impact. So through working with the licence providers in the water market and with the Water Industry Commission, in 8 weeks we chaired a working group which resulted in the first code of conduct in the non-domestic market in water. That's been now, it's been in force since April, operated by Wix. We will be looking at doing some research on the operation of that code in a few months' time to see if there are any lessons that can be learned to improve it. But we're really pleased that we've been the prime mover in many ways in getting that into place, which is helping protect small businesses. We've also made recommendations to DESNES, who consulted on third-party intermediaries in the energy market. And we made a recommendation of a hybrid approach to regulation of third-party intermediaries. They had been proposing a kind of choice of a very limited model or otherwise, but we made a hybrid approach, and I'm pleased to say while that wasn't in their initial consultation, they've actually adopted it and will be proceeding with it. And that means that, in essence, small businesses will be able to access easily kind of tools such as price comparison sites, but also where sort of the third-party intermediaries are actually taking more risky services that might take control of people's money and things like that, there'll be much more stringent regulation, which is very much what we push for.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to hand over to Stephen Kerr.
Yeah, I think Michelle Thompson's questions kind of captured the spirit and mood of the committee this morning. Because in your opening statement, you said, David Wilson said, that your role was about improving consumer confidence, and yet the Scottish Consumer Sentiment Indicator for Q2 is minus 8.9. What has that indicator been for the 3.5 years that you've existed?
Well, clearly, consumer confidence is it's a broad measure and impacted by a wide range of factors. I think where we can make a difference is the confidence of consumers in making purchases, in that sense of feeling of confidence that they have the information to make an informed judgment on what they want to do. Or what they want to purchase and achieve, to make sure they actually get what they pay for, and to make sure that if something is not right or goes wrong, they've got redress and they can deal with it. That's the area that we can work on. We can't, we can't influence wider macroeconomic factors.
Sorry, but you did say in your opening statement that part of your raison d'etre was improving consumer confidence, and I guess I'm asking if it's minus 8.9. In the Consumer Sentiment Indicator at Q2 this year, where has it been? What's the trend been in the last 3.5 years?
I think that I don't have the numbers in front of me in terms of that trend. It has been weak for a number of years, reflecting the wider consumer circumstances, as well as an overall concern that consumers have that the changes in wider markets, particularly the shift to online markets, has increased the concerns that consumers have about how they engage in the market. So we recognise that there are widespread feelings of consumer detriment across the market.
I suppose I'm asking these questions simply to try and understand the KPI. What is the unit of measurement that, in a sense, justifies the existence of Consumer Scotland? Is this one of the indicators? Are there others that we can look at that would tell us whether or not there is an impact?
I think in terms of ultimate outcomes, that is what we're aiming to achieve. But clearly, in terms of attribution of our contribution to that, alongside the very wide range of possible, it's very difficult to make that attribution. But that's ultimately what we're working towards.
So it's not really a very good KPI for Consumer Scotland.
We wouldn't use the consumer detriment survey indicator as an indicator of our performance.
What would you use?
But it was, well, I think what I tried to describe earlier in terms of impact in particular areas, the impact assessment reviews that we're making, the area of undertaking work in our work plan on particular areas, and our recommendations being taken into account by regulators and government. That's where we'd measure our impact. The outcomes in terms of consumers, I think it would be very difficult to assess that in the aggregate. But we'd like to think, for example, just to go back to our investigation earlier in the year, I think we made 9 recommendations, a substantial report which identified for not just the Scottish Government, perhaps particularly for the Scottish Government, the substantial improvements that need to be put in place in terms of accreditation, consumer information, licensing and regulation of the home heating market. That has to be put in place. If it's not put in place, we end up with the sort of huge disappointment and consumer harm that has been done in the solid wall insulation market under the UK government's eco scheme that was reported on fairly recently by the National Audit Office. Where we can make a difference is preventing that sort of problem, and that's where we think we can make a difference in our investigations. And if we can even nudge slightly the high level of concerns and complaints and consumer harm in the used car market, then we will think we've made a difference. So that's how we'd measure our performance.
I totally respect that answer, of course, and you used the plural investigations, but in 3.5 years, you've done one.
Yeah.
You've announced a second. You've given yourself a deadline for the second investigation. But why in 3.5 years? I was intrigued with what the Chief Executive said, that it took you a long time to understand, I think you said, how to conduct an investigation. There are many bodies that have a long history of conducting investigations that we can borrow the learning from. So I don't understand. I suppose I didn't understand your answer, if I'm honest.
I think we could. I'll maybe perhaps ask Sam to add to it. But I think the important is, I think we wanted to take a very deliberate and thoughtful approach to how to undertake and remember a statutory investigation using the powers. I think we could have fairly quickly done investigations, perhaps a lower case, fairly quickly, but we wanted to take a very deliberate and thoughtful approach. And what we did was take advice, and in fact we benefited greatly from a secondment from the Competition and Markets Authority, one of their experienced investigators, to help develop that framework. So I think we did very much what you would be expecting us to do, and that's led to the process that we've now got in place. I think we would be pleased to do more investigations. If we can get to a couple of years, we would like to do that. Inevitably, I'm not trying to have a discussion here about resources, but I think we have to recognise the resources that we have. I think we want to be deliberate and impactful in our investigations rather than perhaps light touch and do a sort of list of recommendations that perhaps get lost. We want to have a real impact.
Well, on the issue of resources, though, you do have 28. Is it still correct? 28 permanent staff? That was at the last annual report, I think.
And that has grown.
Has that grown now? What is it? What is it now?
41.
So you have 41 permanent staff.
And that has increased principally because of the additional functions that we've taken on over the last year. I mentioned the heat advocacy area. That's a new statutory responsibility. So the increases that we have made are because of additional functions, additional activities that both the UK and the Scottish Government have been pushing us towards.
That's a lot of permanent staff to do one investigation in 3.5 years. That's a lot. That's a lot of resource. And I would also note that in the first 2 years, because we don't have any more data than this, there were underspends in each of those years. So this issue about resource is kind of leading to questions.
Can I perhaps ask Sam to give you an update on our staffing and wider impact, and then perhaps bring Sue in on the financial aspects?
Can you understand where I'm coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that
13 staff. So on a baseline of 28, that's almost a 50% increase. Could you just explain what that 50% increase in capacity is and the breakdown of those roles?
So yes, I think you need to remember that we have been a developing organisation for the last 2 or 3 years. We've deliberately built as we've gone along. So we've studied the areas we're operating in, understanding what we need. As David mentioned, actually we've taken on some additional functions over the last year, which we've had additional levy funding for heat networks. So we have an advocacy function for around that, and we are also funding heat networks advice via provided by Citizens Advice Scotland and Advice Direct Scotland. So we have a grant funding mechanism. We've also taken on roles from the Scottish Government in relation to funding the advice bodies in that respect as well. So grant funding for the activities they undertake, for example, the Consumer Helpline. So we've taken on additional functions, and we've always been, part of our plan has been growth as we've grown into being a kind of mature organisation, if you like. So that's the context in which those numbers have grown.
And if I may, can I ask Sue to touch on your point about underspends at year-end?
Yes. So in the first couple of years, one of the challenges has been getting the function set up quickly. So we didn't have an investigations function initially because we took the time to decide what we wanted to do. So we now have 2 people in that function. The increases in staff that we've had over the last year are almost entirely from the funding we get from the Department of Business and Trade in relation to our work on electricity, gas and heat networks. So those where those headcounts have come. They haven't come in the areas funded by the Scottish Government. So we do endeavour, and with any organisation, particularly with heat networks, in the past year, our approval for our budget from Department of Business and Trade this year wasn't received, in fact last year, sorry, wasn't received until September. And so by the time we recruited, we ended up with an underspend because we had those roles funded for the year, but were unable to recruit for them until September in that year. So we always striving to get the best value for the public purse, but also being realistic about the time taken to recruit for new functions and the time it takes to get approval for our budget, not from the Scottish Government, but from the other funders.
Well, the convener asked very specific questions. I'm not sure we got specific answers. Maybe it's something you can send further detail to the committee convener on behalf of the committee so that we can see, more specifically, 41, now 41, did I hear that correctly? 41 permanent. And presumably, from what I understand, you've also had temporary staff on top of that. Is that correct?
Of temporary staff, yeah.
So again, I think we want to know the detail of that. Sorry, convener, are you coming in?
Actually, could I just briefly thought, so we had an almost 50% increase in staff. has the value of your grants increased by 50% to external organisations?
I think we could take it the value of the grants that we now are funded by the Scottish Government to fund other organisations. They haven't increased. No, they certainly haven't increased by 50%. Just to emphasise, the increase in the numbers was an additional function that we gave, as opposed to ongoing funding of our other activity. We can provide the full details of both our headcount and the funding income and the sort of the flows out to Advice Direct Scotland and Citizens Advice Scotland. Happy to provide that in writing.
This is the first year we funded Advice Direct Scotland's advice line. So in the previous year it was funded by Scottish Government.
Okay.
Right. I mean, there are obviously lots of questions that would follow in from further information, including your annual report, which we don't have. So let me ask you about the requirement under the legislation, I think, for an independent review of the performance of Consumer Scotland, which is, I suppose, timely to the line of questioning of this morning. It's due when? Has it been commissioned, and who are the independent reviewers?
We are in the process of implementing that now. We've agreed, and the board has agreed, a remit which sets out what we expect that review to cover, and that's very much looking at our development as an organisation, whether we have put in place an
Can we see that?
We'd be happy to share share the remit. We are currently seeking to find a reviewer or an organisation that can undertake that review, and we intend to have that commissioned and complete by the end of the financial year.
The financial year. But aren't you required to have commissioned it by April of this year?
It was, I think the term, if I remember it correctly, was to commission it as soon as possible after after the end of the year.
So one not of the by factors, April?
No, it wasn't by April. It was from April, if you like, as soon as possible after April. And one of the things that we did want to make sure was that a reviewer had access to our full financial information and our performance information. So in a sense, we thought it would be better in the latter half of the year rather than the first half.
I've probably taken too much time already, but I have one last question, and that is in relation to consumer duty. Now, you do have a role to play in reflecting that as of sometime, I think in the spring of this year, the requirement for consumer duty to be borne in mind by public sector bodies came into force in April 24, but is now active, fully active, April 25. So maybe you can tell us, we're now in October, nearly November. What have you been doing to see that this duty that rests on public bodies is being fulfilled?
Yes, so we published the final guidance in February 25. We had interim guidance in place and a consultation running alongside that. So since then, we've undertaken a number of information sessions with around 40 public bodies, including government, local authorities, health boards, regulators, 10 bespoke webinars to public bodies at senior decision-maker level, and then also information sessions across the 5 Scottish Government Director General areas. And we've also run a number of sessions which have been really popular for small businesses and third sector organisations to help strengthen their influence. So we continue to raise awareness. Obviously, it's quite early in the process to determine how well it's working, but we expect that we don't have a formal role in monitoring. Our duty was to publish the guidance, which we have done, but we are obviously interested and committed to making sure that this works for consumers and drives the right actions.
Monitoring its
we don't have a formal role in monitoring its effectiveness. However, we would like to do that. And we're aiming to carry out an analysis of all the annual report and accounts in the first instance when they're published for 24-25 to see what bodies have been doing in relation to consumer duty, and also looking at the impact assessments that are published by bodies, and hopefully then making recommendations on the basis of that.
Is that how you will determine whether or not they are living up to the consumer duty?
Yes, we believe so.
Right. Okay, and that's visible?
Yes. It will be. once we've done that. So the guidance is there already. Organisations need to publish any consumer duty impact assessments they do and also reference in their annual report and accounts.
Right, okay. Again, lots of questions come from that, but I recognise I'm probably past my time.
We're happy to take any questions offline if you want more information.
Okay, perhaps just maybe sort of complete that discussion, at least for now, is I think we, and I think I said this last year, we see the consumer duty as a potentially quite sort of radical change in the way public bodies work. It's, it's a tool to enhance the effectiveness. It's public service reform around effectiveness rather than perhaps just about financial efficiency. It's something that our role has been, as Sue's very clearly described, it's about sort of monitoring and guidance. I think it's about guidance and advice. I think there is a next stage which is about monitoring and to then ultimately enforcement and encourage. That's not where we have. That's not what our legislation says. It's an area that I think will evolve. But the consumer duty, I think, is a very, very important part both of our work, but a very important initiative.
We see it as your job to monitor its implementation.
Formally, that lies with the Scottish Government. I think where we have discussions with the Scottish Government, we'd be happy to take on that role. But at the moment, the monitoring and enforcement role is more.
And who specifically?
Sorry?
Who specifically?
It's the public bodies, team within the Scottish Government. I think that would sit probably within Ivan McKee's area in terms of public service reform. So it's a government area. But as I say, that it's a conversation that's ongoing about whether or not the government would like us to play a bigger role.
So you are talking about it?
We have already built up some really good case studies, and we'd like to do more of that because that in itself helps the public bodies understand how to do it well and the benefits of it.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in Sarah Boyack.
Thank you very much. I want to dig into two of the key objectives you've got in terms of consumer protection, in terms of environment, climate emergency and homes. And that's come up a couple of times, but in your report you talk about the need for 2 million homes to be upgraded in Scotland, old, energy efficient, lots of new opportunities. So I want to focus on a couple of things. Firstly, the massive retrofit rip-offs people have experienced. And I want to ask a direct question about what solutions are now in place and what support or compensation will homeowners get having experienced that rip-off as a result of the work that you've done in Consumer Scotland?
So our investigation, which was published in June, obviously looked at the issues we looked at. 2.4 million homes need to decarbonise heating. 1.5 million homes don't have a good standard of energy efficiency. The investigation recommendations were that the Scottish Government and UK Government need to run national campaigns to engage consumers in the benefits of the introduction of EPCs, that they need to do something about what is frankly the guddle of licensing schemes, accreditation schemes, consumer protection schemes and redress schemes. From a consumer perspective, it is extremely hard to navigate and not at all clear. So we've recommended that the UKG and the Scottish Government need to introduce mandatory accreditation standards for traders in that sector to increase consumer confidence in it. And that the UK Government need to simplify and consolidate the standards bodies, the kind of consumer protection codes and the certification for low carbon energy efficiency measures that are in existence. And as you know, there are a number of different organisations in that space. Also, there needs to be a streamlined and accessible and consistent consumer complaints and redress system. And again, it's about trying to create a simple and straightforward consumer journey, I should say, and improving information sharing. We're pleased to see there has been some progress. So the Scottish Government published or Labour for Parliament draft EPC regulations, I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago. They're really quite important. They're a key step in informing consumers and giving consumers the information they need, I think, to look at their own houses and what they need to do. We've actively engaged with the UK Government on standards and protection. I was a member of the DESNZ advisory panel on the Ofgem review over the last few months, reviewing Ofgem, and have absolutely highlighted the importance of more streamlined and effective consumer-focused regulation in this space. and hope to hear more about that from obviously UK government soon. And I suppose the other key area in that sense is that a key part of the net zero transition for homeowners, for many homeowners, as you probably know, there are about 30,000 homes on heat networks at the moment.
We're going to come to that. I'm talking about
right.
retrofitting at the moment, which is a different issue.
Fine. Yeah. So, okay, yeah.
So in terms of the changes it's made, you've made quite a lot of recommendations. If you think about it, there's actually quite a few Scottish government-funded organisations out there. Have they started changing their standards, how they operate, thinking of area-based retrofit schemes? What difference have consumers actually seen already, and what's coming next?
I think that's a work in progress, is the honest truth. We, as I say, we published in June. We are actively engaged with the Scottish Government Heating Buildings division team on the range of consumer issues in that space. One of the things we've been talking to them about, for example, is the review they will be doing over the next couple of years, I think, on the Home Energy Scotland system and the support and the grant schemes they get. One of the things we've been very, very clear about is that the eventual result of that, the outcome of that, needs to be clearly tested with the consumers so it works for consumers. And on the other side of that equation, a lot of the accreditation schemes, the standard schemes, the redress schemes are actually fall within consumer protection, which is reserved and within the remit of the UK government. And as I say, we hope that, in essence, you need a restructuring and a reform of that sector. That will take time, but it's absolutely something that we've fed into the UK government generally, but also specifically in the sense of the regulatory review, the review of Ofgem as the regulator and how regulation in that sector needs to work. So we hope that will be good progress.
And do you then update in terms of what's happened next? Do you feed back into both Scottish and UK government about what's actually happening? And then how does it link into, you've talked about Citizens Advice Scotland and Advice Direct Scotland. So if I'm giving advice to constituents, it's a bit of an irony. I wasn't aware of this work till I read the committee papers today. There's something about how do you communicate this to people that are involved, whether it's MSPs or councillors, to support constituents?
So I think actually there's a theme here. I think you're wanting more information from us, and I think we're very happy to provide that. In fact, not happy to, would be pleased to. I think that we had, I think we maybe had proposed this last year, but it would be, in terms of our work programme development for this year, we'd be really happy to host a committee for a session in that, maybe informally go through some of the issues that you're experiencing, thinking about how we can address those. In terms of the specific question, I suppose we published the investigation, got a lot of coverage at the time. I think it's the most successful coverage area for us so far. It was included in communications with our quarterly newsletter that went around MSPs and MPs. But we'll be very happy to share more information and indeed take any further feedback.
Just briefly make two additional points. I think the first is in terms of the direct advice to consumers and any constituents who have concerns and complaints. I mean, the immediate advice that they could get on these matters is, please, with Citizens Advice Scotland and Advice Direct Scotland, that we support financially to undertake the activities. So that frontline advice is with them, and we work very closely with them to do that. But perhaps I just wanted to reiterate what what I know you recognise and others recognise, that the conversion of our homes, domestic properties in Scotland, is both an integral and essential part of the wider transition to net zero and addressing the climate change challenge. It couldn't be more important, but it will also require the active engagement of millions of consumers who will have to make decisions on the basis of advice, information with redress, and the very, very clear set of recommendations from our investigation is that framework within which consumers can make decisions is not good enough yet, and it's not good enough at Scottish level or UK level. And the NAO report about the eco scheme just confirmed that in quite striking and in fact quite just jaw-dropping detail. So we've got to get this right. And that's why we regard this as so important. The immediate focus is around the Heat and Buildings Bill, which could not be more important in this area.
So I'm going to come on to that. The issue about heat networks.
Sure.
So every local authority in Scotland's now got an LHES plan. We're going to see more and more new builds, whether it's privately owned by homeowners or whether it's built to rent. So this is absolutely a now issue. But I did a declaration of interest earlier about working for SFJ. It's not just that, it's also the social rented sector. And a lot of us in the last year have had astronomical heating bills from existing heat networks that on paper look fantastic, but actually you're talking about low income renters who cannot afford it. So what is the protection now? It's not just about what's going forward, but it's actually now, because a lot of us have had that. And yes, going to Sitton's advice, actually, how do you support those renters because the bills have gone up? It's not a theoretical issue, it's a now issue.
It's something we have been very, very concerned about, and we have contacted some of the companies concerned. Our understanding is that, in essence, this is a hangover from the gas price hike, which has driven bills through the roof, and some of the organisations involved delayed passing as long as they could, and then did. But some of the, I can't remember the percentage, but I remember it was, I think one of them was 300 or 400%. It was extraordinary. So there are two or three things. Our real concern is those people themselves, but our concern is also that the reputational impact this has on consumer confidence in heat networks, because, as you know, the target would see around about 400,000 homes on them by 2030. And only 30,000 at the moment, but people need to be confident they are not going to be experienced that. So regulation is coming in January by Ofgem. I could talk you through some of the recommendations and things we've been talking about in that. But in terms of the existing heat networks, I don't think there are, the best I can recommend for existing consumers is they go to the advice bodies who can try and help them. Something we have pressed Scottish Government on is introducing a heat networks efficiency scheme for existing heat networks. A lot of them are using what is now relatively old technology, quite often not low carbon technology. And a heat networks efficiency scheme, one exists in England and Wales, would allow scoping studies and looking at trying to work out how you effectively replace and upgrade those so they work more effectively and more efficiently. And of course, if they're using low carbon technology rather than fossil fuel technology, they won't be as prone to the variable nature of the fossil fuel prices. So that's something we've been pushing Scottish Government on, and I know they are looking at it. It could be relatively low cost, we think, and it might even be as straightforward as buying into the England and Wales scheme and showing that around the UK, and sharing that in Scotland.
Because actually, you've talked about the different types of power, but it could be offshore wind and solar going forward. That's not gas, that's not old carbon. So there's something about it's the confidence, but it's also for those running the schemes who this is not where they expect it to be. So it feels like an absolutely centre stage, but what are the results that are coming from the work that Consumer Scotland's done? And actually, how do you, again, communicate with us? Because it's such a now issue. You've got the Heat and Buildings Bill, you've got the carbon budgets legislation that was passed a couple of weeks ago. This is absolutely a now issue. If you don't get this right, it's massive in terms of businesses, consumers, owners and renters. It could not be more centre stage. So it's partly the comms, but it's also the recommendations. And how do we see does this come out in your next report? How do you feed back to MSPs, not just in this committee, but across Parliament? Because all MSPs are going to have a very big interest in this very soon.
So we've done a lot of research on heat networks, but in particular, I suppose the the really primary focus area over the past year or 18 months, apart from setting up the advice and advocacy services, which we did, has been that Ofgem are developing their regulatory system, which is due to come in January. We've been very heavily involved in responding to the various consultations and talking to them.
Happy with what they're going to introduce?
Well, okay. We're happy with some of what they're going to introduce. We support, I suppose, they're adapting, using the vulnerability definition for heat networks that is also used for gas and electricity. And we're very, not support, I mean, we've pressed for and also the requirement for the use of priority service registers. We have recommended that Ofgem ensure that the costs of heat are unbundled from other services that heat networks. So, you know, quite often, as you mentioned, this will be renters. It might be bundled into the rental cost, which doesn't help transparency, doesn't help payment. So that's absolutely something we've been pressing Ofgem for in regulation. We recognise it's a complex thing to do. There's a potential need for some legislative change. So I don't know if that will be in place for January, but it's certainly something we think needs to happen and have been pressing for.
Important for renters who get benefits.
Absolutely.
For their rent,
yes.
Maybe not for other services.
Yeah,
yep.
Completely agree. We've also recommended a ban on disconnection from non-payment of heat bills through heat networks, which should be the same as for gas and electricity consumers. And, you know, in the last resort, suppliers could install a PPM, which is, you know, it's not ideal, but it's better than disconnection. And so we've recommended that. I think that Ofgem are certainly actively looking at that, so we're hopeful of that one. One thing that we disagree with Ofgem on is they've proposed effectively a two-tier system. So for not-for-profit heat networks, as opposed to business-operated heat networks, there may be less. They're currently looking at less stringent standards, and that's something that we have opposed because it sort of has consumer protection concerns, but also it just risks consumer confusion, and this journey needs to be simple. So that's something that we've actively engaged in. So I think that's a sort of summary. We do have published on our website all of our consultation responses. They're very detailed on this issue. I'd be very happy to share them or to maybe have a sort of offline discussion about some of those.
Okay,
and Gordon,
thank you very
I think
much.
you're quite interested in that.
Hand back to convener.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'd like to bring them Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to ask about two specific consumer issues which are covered either in the work you've done or potentially in your future work programme. And the first is the question of migration to digital landlines, where I noticed that there's been an impact assessment review of the work that you've done previously. And just to contextualise this, it's a huge issue in rural areas, including areas I represent in mid-Scotland and Fife. I had a horrific case just a few weeks ago during Storm Amy, where an elderly lady fell in her house during a power cut caused by Storm Amy. She did not have phone contact with the outside world. She lives in an area where there's no mobile phone connectivity. She was fortunately called on by a neighbour. The neighbour could not make contact with the ambulance service, had to drive her car 2 miles down the road to get a mobile signal, and then had to go back and be completely in the dark, waiting with no contact with the outside world for the ambulance to turn up some hours later. And so it's a really serious issue. So I think what I'm interested in understanding, therefore, is what was the impact of the work that you did in this area, and what practical improvements have there been? Because we're still getting issues arising.
Absolutely. I mean, that sounds horrendous. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. And I think that the kind of the importance of this is sort of comes out of the research and the analysis we did. So 62% of people with a landline in Scotland still use that for calls, and 74% of those people over 65 use landlines. So use landlines to make calls. So they're still a really integral part of the infrastructure. I think that bears out the point you made. And I suppose the risks in rural areas are those you've set out, and added to the fact that there's a poorer than average mobile signals, and as you mentioned, kind of more frequent and longer lasting power cuts. We made recommendations to telecoms providers, Ofcom and governments that there needed to be much greater consumer awareness and reduce the risks of the digital switchover. The UK government agreed, and I have to say I think we were the prime movers in some of this as well. The UK government agreed that the public awareness of the migration could be improved. As a result of that, the telecoms industry has led a national communications campaign, which is now live, focused on telecare users, and that's running as we speak, but certainly in the current period. The UK government has also produced guidance for telecoms providers on how to identify consumers most at needs in the risk of migration, and some of the factors that are used in that were risk factors that we had identified. So we think that we have had a significant impact, because I don't think the campaign would have been there unless we had been pressing for it. So we are pleased, but it's something that we we continue to monitor, and if cases are still arising that are relevant, we'd be very pleased to hear about that, because, well, not pleased, but we'd be grateful to hear about that so that we can take further action if needed.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is there's clearly more work to be done here, because I know Openreach have a service that will provide people with battery backup for digital landlines. So even in the event of a power cut, they can still use them. I'm not sure awareness of that service is particularly high. And certainly in the case I referred to, the lady did not have that service. So I think there's a need for much more proactivity on that. Okay, well, that's really helpful. Let me ask you about another issue, because I noticed in your forward work programme you talk about work on postal services, which clearly is an issue where there's a lot of change coming down the track. David, you mentioned earlier the work you're doing or have done around online markets. And one of the issues we've seen an explosion in recent years is home delivery companies. Now, I don't know if your work on postal services also covers home delivery companies or not, or whether that's a separate piece of work you have done or might be looking at doing.
We've done substantial work on post, and particularly the changes to the universal service obligation. I'm happy to go into that. But alongside that, I think we monitor very closely the issues around home deliveries and the parcel market. We published a report in August last year called Lost in the Post about experiences of consumer detriment in the parcel market, and I think that was an important stepping stone to continuing advocacy in this area. It's about having hard data on how consumers are impacted by problems in terms of parcel deliveries. And it's very clear there are substantial problems. I think that report was really useful in drawing them out in terms of the problems of lost parcels, delays in parcel delivery, the lack of effective redress and complaints mechanisms. It's something, as I say, that we're very alive to. And I think just to pick out some of the continuing areas that we're seeking to advocate around. I mean, clearly in rural areas, perhaps at the heart of this question, many of these challenges and problems are, a degree or a significant degree worse, and more challenging, less competition, less availability, less or greater concerns raised by consumers. But the concerns are more broadly based. I mean, I think there's a particular challenge about safe places to leave parcels, and we've probably all got personal experience of that many people don't have a safe place that they'd be comfortable to leave, but often parcels are left in any case. And I think what we'd like to build up and be more assured about is that the delivery companies are more transparent and provide information on their standards of service in this area. They have more effective complaints mechanisms to deal with a situation when it goes wrong. But also recognising that in terms of a partial delivery by one business using a delivery company, that the responsibility in terms of consumer legislation and consumer, the responsibility is with the sender and the seller, not with the deliverer. And so it's making sure that, whether it's back to the discussion we had earlier about small businesses, that the parcel delivery companies are more accountable, more transparent, and more effective in the work that they do.
I mean, I could quote you lots of examples of cases that have come to me about, deliveries not happening, deliveries to the wrong address, delivery companies claiming they've delivered, but they haven't in fact. Every seemed to be a particularly poor exemplar in this respect. And in fact, the Courier newspaper ran a story, I think, 2 weeks ago, with some examples of every across Tayside just not performing. But going back to the more general theme I started on, and there's been a bit of a theme in this committee. You say you've done work on this,
yes,
and you're encouraging. I guess what committee members are trying to get to is what is the value of the organisation? What are you actually doing that's going to make a difference to consumers?
Well, I'm really struck in both your questions about about both landlines and parcel delivery. They're areas we've worked on. We've, I think, been very transparent, particularly on the landline issue in terms of charting where we see that transmission from what we've done through to decisions and improvements that face the consumer. But I've received very clear message this morning that there's more we can do in terms of both communicating that to you, but I think communicating it more broadly to consumers. I wouldn't want to say that that's an entirely justifiable question and challenge from you in terms of perhaps justifying our existence. I wouldn't want to do that communication solely to be justifying our existence, but it is an absolutely core part of our activities as an organisation to be setting out clearly what we expect of of business, of regulators, of governments, what we have recommended, what we're expecting them to make changes to and why, and to make sure that we're transparent when we're successful in doing that, and when we like it to go further than it has done so far. Just by perhaps way of example of that, I think the post area and the USO, if I don't get a chance to talk too much about that, is that's an area where we've engaged very actively with Royal Mail and Ofcom in terms of the changes, which are a fairly fundamental change in the way that we will all use postal services. I mean, this is a fairly stark and change. And at least in terms of one fundamental component of it, the move to what's called the 2.5 deliveries per week model of alternate days for second-class deliveries. We've been very clear, we don't feel convinced, we're not convinced that has been fully justified by the process that Ofcom and Royal Mail have been through. We'd like that to be constantly monitored now that Ofcom have made the decision that that's the model that they've approved. But we've been clear that's an area we're not persuaded by, and we will be holding them to account as much as we can.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring in Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning to you. I've a couple of questions for you. First one is to explore the relationship that you have with organisations like Citizens Advice Direct Scotland, and also trading standards, just to see how local issues on the ground that are raised by consumers locally in my constituency and members' constituencies reach those organisations and then reach you as a national body, and how you gather in those issues that are particularly raised with you, so that you can make recommendations and help to influence change with Scottish Government and other stakeholders.
So I think Sue will take that initially.
So what we're very conscious that the landscape's quite fragmented, and we have chosen not to deliver advice direct to consumers ourselves, but to fund, with the help of the Scottish Government and the bodies that do so, so mainly Advice Direct Scotland and Citizens Advice Scotland, And one of the things about that is how do we ensure that the money that we're providing to them is used sensibly, and that we're making sure that we've got a consistent approach across the landscape, and also that that's providing value for money and not duplication. So we'll be aware that Heat Networks is an example where Advice Direct Scotland will be providing the Tier 1 advice, and the Extra Help Unit as part of CAS will be providing the Tier 2 advice. So because we are funding them, we have regular meetings with them, talking about what are the issues they're seeing, what can we help with, and also trying to, I think what you're saying is, gather up what are the big issues. Are they what we are looking at? Because we don't want to be looking at the wrong things if that's not what's impacting consumers. And that does feed into certainly when we're working through our work programmes for the following year, and also influences the work that we're doing. Specifically with trading standards, obviously we've been working with them as part of our last investigation. I imagine probably be involved in the next investigation by the nature of it. And also we're trying to also bring all the different players across the landscape together around scams to understand what more we can do and how can we make it cohesive so that we've not got lots of organisations duplicating activity. So I do think there's an opportunity to look across the landscape. We have a CEO group of all the relevant bodies across the landscape, which Sam chairs, and that's been really useful again at sharing issues and trying to make sure that we are utilising the money that's available wisely and that there's not duplication across those different bodies.
Yeah.
Perhaps I just a brief point to that I think it's very important that we take very seriously this role as a funder of these organisations, and making sure that value for money and effectiveness is taken into account. But I couldn't emphasise more strongly the way we see our relationship with Citizens Advice Scotland, ADS, trading standards. It's a two-way partnership. It's not in any sense a sort of top-down funding relationship in any way. And consistent with everything I think that's been said this morning, we see it as absolutely crucial to the achievement of our functions that we have a highly effective advisory function done by partner organisations in Scotland. But likewise, in terms of, just by example, just to draw out the investigations, I think the work that we've done around home heating and the used car area and scams and others, we've provided a complementary sort of research and investigation function, which has been hugely valuable to trading standards and complements their work. So it's very much a two-way relationship, and I just couldn't emphasise that more strongly.
Can I add one thing as well?
So, yeah.
You asked about the data, I suppose, and we have arrangements in place with both, well, actually trading standards as well, but also Advice Directors Scotland and CAS, where they feed to us the data they're getting in a kind of aggregated format, and we use that in some of the decisions we take. I mentioned prioritisation process on investigations, for example. That was very much formed by ADS data on their second highest complaints about used cars. So we use their data regularly. The other thing that we do is there's something called the Consumer Protection Partnership, which operates at the UK level, which is effectively convened by DBT. And we're making sure that the Scottish advice data is in that format as well. It's in that context, because a lot of the powers around consumer protection are reserved, and it's important that they are sort of fed into UK decisions as well as the work we do. So the value of that data is really, really powerful, especially when it's complemented by our research to get behind some of the questions.
Yep. I mean, who do you think that consumers expect to make the kind of changes that they're hoping for? Is it you? Is it bodies like Trading Standards? Is it even MSPs? I mean, people come to my local office and complain about something, and the hope is that something will change, that merits change. So they look to you to effect change. And could consumers look at your report when it comes out next month, David, and see, great, we raised that issue last year and change is afoot? Is that a reasonable expectation for consumers to have?
I think that there's no single organisation that can, answer or provide that service. I think for consumers looking for, that sense of advice, support, encouragement, information, then they could go to the tried and trusted, services available. If they want advocacy, at that sort of political space, they would know where to come. So, different horses for courses, I suppose is my immediate response. What I think it would, our particular contribution to that is, and I think this is perhaps why we take so seriously our role as a statutory advocacy organisation, which we have an equivalent organisation in Northern Ireland, but there isn't a statutory consumer advocate in England or Wales. That you would expect, a consumer could look to us to be, if you like, championing the corner of consumers in the areas where they are concerned about, and that they're, advocating on their behalf on the particular issues, whether it's, energy, post, and others. And I think that's where we fit in. And I'd hope that, a consumer who is perhaps concerned about, whether it's RTS meters or the other things that we've talked about before, could look at our website, could get an understanding of what we do, and could think, yeah, here's a public body that's fighting my corner.
Okay. Another issue is consumer debt. It's on the up. I think even you've reported that it's on the up in a whole range of areas, whether it's local goods and services or whether it's energy prices, energy debt and so on and so forth. Consumer debt seems to be going up significantly. Are consumers telling you or anybody else that they need different and better arrangements? They need help to pay the level of debt that they're incurring? I mean, if you look at the Consumer Credit Act, the standard 30-day term to pay a bill probably hasn't changed for 50 years. I mean, so are consumers saying that to you, David, through your engagement with them, that they need better arrangements to help them to manage things like the debt that they face?
Undoubtedly, yes.
Yeah,
I mean, best place to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, yes, it is true, and consumers need much more support, and I think it's been made much worse by the energy crisis, by the cost of living crisis. We run an energy tracker each spring, just after the winter, and in the most recent one published earlier this year, while about 60% of consumers said they were easily managing to afford their energy bills, the really alarming figure was 15% were in debt or arrears, and that figure had gone up from 9% the previous year. It absolutely makes out your point. And, we've recommended that Ofgem create a debt relief scheme effectively using money within the industry, and I'm pleased that they're working actively on that. I think we're expecting to see the first parts of that early next year as part of a kind of a broader debt strategy that they'll be operating in the energy sector. There are also issues around debt in the water sector as well. And some of those relate to confusion over people not even understanding that they have to pay their water bill separately, that they don't get a discount because it's included in the council tax billing, and it's not clear necessarily to people that the reduction they get for council tax doesn't necessarily apply to water. So there are issues around that and communication. And we're working with the Scottish Government in particular on that, because they're responsible for charging and Scottish Water, to see how that can be improved. But there's an interesting question there on the Consumer Credit Act, which I think we maybe should explore.
I mean, you don't control it, we don't control it. Yeah. We know where it is controlled, but our consumers must surely be crying out for this kind of help. And is it something that we will be able to see in your report when it comes out about this major issue, if only to flag it up, if only to try and influence thinking in another area, another place, about how society deals with consumer debt and how we help people to deal with it better?
Yeah, I mean, just to paint a wider picture on that. So one of the particular bits of work that we're doing is developing what we call it's our consumer welfare report, which will be published, we expect around September next year, and it's one of the statutory requirements in the legislation. And that will be a balance of sort of like comprehensiveness, a comprehensive assessment of the state of the consumer experience, if you like. It'll be comprehensive, but we hope it'll be readable and digestible at the same time. And I think debt will be at the heart of that. And so we've already published a number of reports about consumer detriment around energy, water, as Sam has covered. So issues of debt and issues about the potential risks of building up debt, both because of affordability issues with, like the gas price hikes, over the last couple of years, but just more generally the easy availability of debt, the changes in terms of hire purchase agreements and modern versions of, these are things that are affecting consumers directly, and there's the sort of issues that we'd like to pick up on in our consumer welfare report. And perhaps just pick out one issue that I think is important is in terms of dealing with affordability and debt and targeting support to the consumers that really need it, is what we've found at both Scottish and UK level is that there's been legitimate calls that we have, we've been part of to find mechanisms to target support at energy users and other users. And often what government has found is that they haven't got a ready mechanism or a route to find a way to target the consumers that they would really ideally want to get support to. And that's an area where we've established a number of, we've published a number of reports in energy, and we've developed work on water as well, to try and make recommendations of sort of operational mechanisms to target water poverty and energy poverty. And I think that's a crucial area that we've tried to build up an expertise and a modelling capability on, as something that we hope governments will pick up and use. And certainly in terms of a real concern about water poverty, that we, over the coming year, as Scottish Water and the Water Industry Commission and the Scottish Government are looking at issues about future water prices, that we definitely want to make sure that issues of water poverty are taken into account, both as part of that and alongside it in the coming year.
Okay, I'm pretty sure, Convener, that the committee will be interested in that and providing whatever assistance we can to influence that agenda, because clearly it's getting worse. In your own figures, Sam, the 9 to 15%, it's nearly doubling the number of people that are in energy in households in Scotland. We need to do something to try and assist. So thanks very much for your answers, and thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Kevin.
Thank you, Convener, and it is still good morning. My first number of questions are for you, Mr Wilson. Chair of the board, you seem to be in the driving seat today. Do you think that Consumer Scotland provides value for Scottish taxpayers' money?
I absolutely. I think we are... The nature of the organisation that we are, we're building a new area. I mean, the issue of consumer advocacy...
Give me an example of where you think value has been provided for consumers and taxpayers here in Scotland.
I think we've made a difference in a number of the areas that we've already discussed.
Give me an example.
No, perhaps go back to the landlines issue that we talked about before. We've been at the heart of influencing UK government regulators to take into account the Scottish experience, and particularly the circumstances of the north of Scotland, in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have done otherwise.
Okay.
And I think that's an example. I think the example of the statutory investigation that we made on home heating, the experience of consumers where, for the UK government's eco scheme, where there wasn't in place the sort of things that we've been advocating for, has led to very direct damage.
Okay, let's move on.
We're trying to influence that.
Let's move on. Productivity. Are you happy with the productivity of Consumer Scotland as chair of the board?
In terms of the what we are delivering now as an organisation, I think delivery of the investigation, the investigation. I think we have been very...
Can I stop you there? Because you have carried out one investigation in the time of the existence of the organisation. About to embark on a second one. It's maybe coincidental that that's announced the day before you appear before a parliamentary committee. Do you think that one investigation, one about to come, is good in terms of productivity?
To recognise, the investigation is one part of the broad range of activities that we do. We've published, I think I said earlier, 91 published reports. We've had extensive engagement with wider public bodies.
Okay, let's look at the reports.
So in terms of investigation,
sorry, Mr Rosslyn. I've got very little time and I want to get to the nub of all of this. 91 reports, you've just said. 200 recommendations or thereabout have been made. Can you give me examples of where the recommendations that you have made a real difference to Scottish consumers, including my constituents?
The two areas that we've already touched on, in the interest of time, on landlines, we've set out in our published report, almost line by line, how what we have said has led to decisions and actions by the appropriate regulatory body and government on how different. I would never say that we're, that's solely because of what we've done. I'm not seeking to take, that credit, but there's a direct link between what we've said, what we've done, the research evidence that we've provided, the advocacy and the action. And we've been very transparent about that.
I think maybe you can set out in detail to the committee the real differences that you have made in that sphere. I think that would be useful. In terms of the 200 recommendations that you have made, do you track to see who has listened and what change has been made? And if so, could we, as a committee, see that tracking?
We're happy to share what we do in terms of the 200 or so recommendations. I think two things I'd say about that. One is the areas of recommendations is not a sort of binary yes/no that a government will accept or others will accept. These are ongoing recommendations, and so it will require, it requires time for this to work through. So we felt at this stage, I'm probably saying that of the 100, 92 have been accepted or acted upon. We're not at that stage yet. But we'd like to get to that point, and we're more than happy to share that with the committee when it's.
Well, I can't understand why you wouldn't be tracking that at this moment in time.
No, we are tracking that, but I'm just saying it's perhaps not complete in terms of the impact of the individual areas. For example, I think the test of the recommendations in our investigation report that we published in June, July, will be. In large measure on how that influences the government's heat and buildings bill, which we talked about earlier. That's due, that's some months away. So there's a time gap in terms of making the recommendations accepted, but the principle that you're setting out of tracking the recommendations, 100% with you.
Well, I think the committee would like to see what tracking you've got at this moment in terms of the recommendations that you've made and whether or not they have been accepted and have made any real change to Scottish consumers. As well as a substantial amount of money from the government, you also are in receipt of levies from Energy, Post and Water. Could you give us an indication of how much income you have had from levies from energy companies, please?
Right. I'll perhaps ask Sue to give you the details of that. The precise mechanisms for how that levy support is channeled through to us is probably a long answer in its own right.
I'm not really interested in that. Exactly. I'm interested in the number, first of all. Thank you.
Sue will give you that.
Yes, so we receive in 24-25 £2.4 million from the Scottish Government for our core funding, and in addition, an additional £950,000 which came in the ABR, which was for the CAS advocacy grant transferring across to us. In addition, we receive £608,000 for energy, £270,000 for heat networks, £193,000 for post, and then £320,000, which relates to the big energy campaigns, which is run by CAS, as we mentioned earlier, £260,000, which goes back to CITE, England and Wales, in relation to the advocacy work that they still do for Scottish consumers as part of energy. And then from Scottish Water, £392,000.
Substantial sums of money come in from those levies. So give us an example in terms of post, of where you've made a real difference. You've already said that you don't like certain things that are on the cards. I don't think any of us like any of that. Give us a real example of where you think you've made a difference to consumer in post for that 193,000 levy that you've received.
I think there's a substantial engagement that we've had both with Ofcom, Royal Mail, which is again published and set out in terms of the various publications and reports and research that we've done. I think the two areas that I draw out is I think we've both monitored and sought to influence the revised universal service obligation that Ofcom have now made their decision about. I think many aspects of that we have welcomed and we've worked with them. I think we recognise and acknowledge that the postal market is radically changing. But as I described it, I think the 2.5-day a week model is we're not yet persuaded on that, but there's other aspects of it that are, and I think that the voice that we have given to consumers in Scotland, based on research and engagement with those consumers, has been something which perhaps was absent in the past. So that's an area.
So can I stop you there, please, Mr. Wilson? Because my office and the offices of all of us around this table have substantial engagement with the likes of Ofcom, have substantial engagement with energy companies and postal services and Scottish Water and others. Our resources as MSPs are marginal. I have the equivalent of 3.5 full-time folk working for me. You have to do a hell of a lot more than this. You have got a huge amount of money coming in levies to advocate for Scottish consumers, and yet it seems very, very difficult for you to give me any tangible change that you have made, any tangible difference that you have made to Scottish consumers.
Well, as I was saying about the postal services, I think the additional areas that we've sought to influence Ofcom and the Royal Mail on are the fact that the overall targets that Royal Mail are held to by Ofcom, there are not regional-based targets for the islands in Scotland, which we think is an obvious gap. And that is an area that we'd like them both to more closely monitor the performance of Royal Mail in the islands and to establish a specific postcode-based target in that area. And a second aspect of the work we've done in that area was to seek to persuade Ofcom and Royal Mail to put in place a consumer and customer forum in Scotland where they can better understand the circumstances of Scottish consumers, and I'm pleased that they took on board that recommendation and we'll play a part in that going forward. They're just another example of the area that we've sought to influence. But in terms of your particular point about the constituency...
Can I stop you, Mr Wilson, because you keep using the word influence. Right? We all try and influence various things. All of us try and influence things all of the time. Right? But in terms of the influence that I have been involved in over the piece, I am always able to give tangible examples of change that I have made for my constituents and be able to show that my influence has made a difference. Not always, but, you know, a lot of the time. What really is quite frustrating here today is you have been telling us all of the things that we already know around about energy companies, around about parcel delivery companies, and have talked about the frustrations and have said that you've tried to influence, but you're unable to really hit upon any tangible changes. And I think that, you know, from my perspective, my constituents, if they were watching this, would be going, what is the purpose of that organisation? What real difference are they making to my life at this moment in time when I've got to deal with cost of living, high energy bills, dodgy parcel companies and a postal service that's going to the dogs?
I think the message I'm very clearly hearing from you, and I think already accepted, is I welcome the fact that I think you would like to know more about what we do, to know where we can influence. And I think if there are mechanisms or ways that we can share the insights, the research that we are taking to the governments, the regulators and others, which could potentially assist you in terms of your constituency work and indeed your parliamentary work, we'd be delighted to take that forward. So, for example, on posts, I mean, the number of specific research publications, and we published around the time of the Ofcom decision a briefing note setting out the issues that we've got. These are, I would have thought, very valuable and useful to you, and if we can share that information with you, we'd be delighted to do so.
Well, some of that may be valuable, but you're not communicating any of that very well. I've read some of the reports, and quite frankly, they tell me nothing new. That's the reality. That's the reality. They're not going to tell my constituents anything new either. But what I would say about all of that, the amount of reports is not that great either. We haven't seen this year's annual report and how many there have been since. But in terms of publications, that's not great either. I would have great concern if I were you as chair of the board around about productivity here, quite frankly. Because, if my office was working at the snail's pace that Consumer Scotland seems to be doing in terms of publications, then, I would not be a happy man. Thank you very much, Convener. Thank you.
Can I just ask 2 or 3 supplementary questions? Obviously, we don't have the annual report in front of us, but having just quickly jotting down the numbers that we were just provided, could you just clarify what that annual income you've got? I make it with 2.4 million coming from the Scottish Government and then the levy somewhere north of £4.5 million a year. Is that what's the actual figure?
So the figure.
24-25, the budget was 5.3 million.
5.3 million. And in the last year's annual report, you said that you spent 444,000 with third parties, that includes CAS and the Advice Line Scotland. What was the figure for last year?
For last year, it was 1.7 million.
1.7.
And in this year we're in now is about 2.8 million because of the transfer of the grants across from the Scottish Government to ourselves for CAS and ADS.
Okay.
We've funded the Big Energy campaign since we've set up in 2022. Last year, we took on responsibility for funding the Citizens Advice Scotland Consumer Education and Advocacy grant line, which is around about £950,000 a year. This year, we've also taken on the Advice Direct Scotland helpline, which is about £900,000 a year.
Okay, so you increased that proportion. It strikes me that an awful lot of your answers have relied upon actually the work that you fund them to do and your investigations, and yet there's still a substantial amount of money you're spending internally, and critically, of that internal money, only 2 FTE are being spent on those investigations. I just wonder if that balance of expenditure really reflects, I think, the focus on outcomes. I think overall this committee is really asking you to demonstrate.
Okay. So there's a difference between a formal statutory investigation and a lot of the work we do. So if I can give an example, I won't go into investigations, but for example, on water affordability work, the work that we did last year was really quite detailed and extensive economic modelling of water charges and their impact on consumers. We identified that in that process, that only around about 1/3 of those people, first of all, about 10% of people are in water poverty in Scotland. Only about 1/3 of those get the water charges reduction discount scheme because of the way it operates. We've shared that we've published it and we promoted it at the time actually, but we are now actively working with the Scottish Government on Scottish Water on trying to improve that. Those are actually policy decisions for the Scottish Government to change, but we are involved in working groups with them on that, and we will hope to see progress on that during the next strategic review of charges. So that type of, we've had two formal statutory investigations, but we do an awful lot of detailed analysis and other work.
I guess the issue and just to sort of cut through, I think, the subtext is that there's lots of places that people around this committee table can go to get analysis and narration of public policy. I think when we see public money being spent, we actually want to see action and outcomes, and I think that's the frustration we have. And I think particularly given that you state that one of your top risks is about stability, I think we wanted a kind of a clear demonstration of that. And just finally, Mr. Wilson, it's been very striking through this session that you have been the one providing a lot of the answers. When you've done that, you've used the word "we" an awful lot, in particular regarding quite detailed operational matters, such as the detail of the investigations and some of the research work, how that has been done and the effect. Given you're the chair of the board, and I think it's an important principle of governance that there is independence from the board, especially the chair, that there is separation so that the chair and the board can provide oversight. And I think particularly with a view to this, and this is about, the public are entrusting you to oversee the judicious use of public funds, of taxpayers' money. Given the closeness and proximity you clearly have, you've demonstrated you have, do you believe you have sufficient independence from the day-to-day operations in your role as chair of the board?
I do, certainly. I think what I'd draw your attention to is perhaps the strength of the governance that we have in the organisation. We have a really strong board. We have strong systems of audit and risk, audit and risk committee, and I think there is a ongoing challenge from the board to the executive team, and there's regular discussion both on strategic issues and certainly on operational issues. I think perhaps draw out one example of that is, as part of the investigations that we've set out, the approach to investigations that we touched on earlier, we were actually very clear that that was an investigation undertaken by the investigation team, signed off by the chief executive. That wasn't an investigation by the board, but the board played a challenge role through that. So I think in terms of governance and separation, we've got that. I think perhaps I'm more than happy to take some feedback that I should have let my colleagues say more. I know we got the balance wrong on that.
Do you understand presentationally that is actually an issue for us? That if we hear, and it's not the first time I've made this comment, that essentially the chair of a board providing answers of a detailed operational nature, at least I think is incumbent on us to ask that question.
And I agree with you in terms of incumbency, but I think in terms of I think the range of challenges that I think all of you at one point or other have given, I think they are both operational challenges, rightly for a chief executive, but they are also challenges on the nature of the organisation that the board has put in place. Against the backdrop of the legislation that we've had, we can only do what the legislation gives us to some extent, and I think the test of both the governance and performance and effectiveness of the organisation will be forthcoming in the performance review that we touched on earlier, and I think that will go into questions of governance as well as performance and effectiveness. And I think that would be an area that we'd be delighted to discuss with the committee as and when we get the results of that performance review. And that hopefully will give you some reassurance on that. But if it gives a sort of challenge back to us, I think that's something we'd like your views on.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time. And with that, I draw the public session to a close.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.